I have been appointed judge. The basic principle I use for my decisions is this: guilt is always beyond doubt. What if everyone around you was capable of unimaginable cruelty? And what if they called this cruelty justice? This is exactly the question asked by Franz Kafka in his underrated short story, In the Penal Colony. Spoilers ahead. The story follows a traveller to a prison colony who has come to witness an execution. There, the prison officer explains the workings of a horrendous torture device. Through a series of cogs and levers, it uses a blade to carve the victim's crime on their body, murdering them in the process. This whole demonstration is witnessed by both a guard and a condemned man who's about to be executed by the machine. At the end of the story, the officer realises that both he and his device will be decommissioned due to the views of the new commandant of the prison, and they will surely be expelled from the colony. At which point the officer climbs inside his own torture machine. The machine malfunctions, killing him in a brutal and bloody way, and presumably spelling an end for executions at the penal colony. It is a horrifically disturbing story to read, and it illustrates some of the darkest aspects of human nature. In this video, we'll learn how justice can be perverted into cruelty, how we can turn a blind eye to the suffering of others, and how we may end up crucified on the cross of our moral standards. Obviously, I won't be able to cover all the themes of such a rich text here, so I encourage you to go read it for yourself. But without further ado, let's get started. 1. The Cruelty of Morality. Friedrich Nietzsche famously once cast moral standards as an exercise in power, whether that was an aristocratic minority asserting that their way was best, or a majority defining good as whatever serves them. But we don't even need to turn to his philosophy to see this general thought in action. Every day we can see moral condemnation used as a weapon and moral praise used as a reward to encourage certain behaviour. From the parent who scolds the child to inculcate them in a way of life seen as moral, to the politician who attempts to slander whole groups of people as naturally less good than others. Moral language is no doubt a powerful tool in the arsenal of societal control and coercion. And in some ways this is a really helpful thing. If morality did not function like this and everyone was free to choose for themselves what was right and what was wrong, then we'd arguably just have chaos. But Kafka effortlessly demonstrates the dark side of this moral impulse through his short story. The officer argues tirelessly for the existence of his torture death machine on the very grounds that it is an instrument of justice. He paints it as a great tool of morality and righteousness, without which the colony would lose its very sense of good and evil. Even the functioning of the device points in this direction. Over the course of 12 hours, it painstakingly carves a moral onto the flesh of its victim, cutting deeper and deeper until finally they are dead. The machine itself tells us that it is an instrument of righteous retribution, a champion of justice, all while it inflicts unimaginable cruelty on its victims. It's worth noting that the crimes that got someone sent to this tormentous fate were relatively trivial. The condemned man in the tale has done nothing more than fall asleep at his post, and he has only been condemned on the accusation of one captain. He has been given no chance to defend himself and has been sentenced in his absence. The officer has no doubt as to the guilt of the prisoner. After all, he too is an instrument of justice, and his word is the word of morality itself. To admit the possibility of mistakes would be to admit the possibility of being wrong about all sorts of other things, including the very existence of the torture device. After leaving so many men to the fate of this horrible machine, how could the officer entertain the notion that he might have been mistaken? In painting the officer as a man both obsessed with cruelty and justice, Kafka highlights a certain tension within our moral psychology. It is all too tempting to use moral language to disguise an underlying wish to simply be cruel. The foot soldiers of the Spanish Inquisition were not brutalizing innocent Jewish people and Muslims. They were doing God's will. The Committee for Public Safety during the French Revolution were not indiscriminately executing inconvenient people. They were safeguarding their country. Any of us could go on. There are innumerable cases where the cloak of moral language is ripped away to reveal the ugly face of human cruelty. So, what are we to do? We can hardly go on without any sort of moral code. Well, neither myself nor Kafka have the ultimate answers here, but I think that his work puts this unsettling human tendency under a bright spotlight. Whenever we are taking the moral high ground or condemning another person for their sins, it is worth asking ourselves whether our motivation stems from a desire to truly stand up for justice and what we see as right, or whether it is a will to cruelty, carefully disguised with the thin veneer of moral language. But extreme cruelty in a society cannot exist without the majority of people turning a blind eye. And that is where we come to our next point, and have to ask ourselves some deeply uncomfortable questions. And if you want to help me make more videos like this, then consider subscribing to my Patreon and my email list. The links are in the description. 2. The Banality of Evil. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, philosopher Hannah Arendt set out to answer one important question. How could so many people in Germany have gone along with the atrocities committed during the Second World War? Part of her answer, which has since been developed by later thinkers, is that it is incredibly easy for humans to reject their individual judgments and instead consent to the will of authority figures or superiors. Such a tendency can lead us to commit awful actions, or turn a blind eye to immense brutality, all while we convince ourselves that we're not actually doing anything wrong. Some of Arendt's thoughts here were later supported by Stanley Milgram, who conducted an infamous experiment. He found that most people would willingly deliver a lethal dose of electricity to an innocent person, provided that they were told to do so by an authority figure. It seems that there's at least a significant portion of the human psyche that will just go along with cruelty, provided that it is legitimized by an authority. We touched upon this a little in the last section, looking at how people could commit actions that would normally be against their characters, provided they were doing so in the name of justice, the ultimate philosophical authority. And again, Kafka brings out an unpleasant human tendency into the light of day through his short story. In one of his speeches, the officer is waxing lyrical about how things used to be in the Penal Colony under the regime of the last commandant. Then the execution device was seen as a staple of the community. People would come out in droves to watch its brutal display and would stand listening to the screams of its victims for hours. Perhaps they did this out of fear, perhaps because they enjoyed it, perhaps out of a sense of morbid curiosity. But one thing is clear. No one in the crowd stood up and said anything in protest to the executions. Everyone remained still and steady, silent as lambs, while an act of intolerable horror was carried out right before their eyes. Upon the death of the old commandant and the appointment of the new one, the majority of the denizens of the colony suddenly revealed their distaste for this murder-come-torture device. No longer did they turn out to watch the grisly displays of a condemned man, and they cried for it to be decommissioned, for the device itself to be put permanently out of its misery. At first, this might seem like a victory for human nature. All along, people really thought that the device was unacceptably cruel. But I think a different lesson is clear here. Notice how no one stood up to the old commandant while they had something to lose. No one stopped the executions when there was a risk that they themselves would be punished. They waited until it was safe to display their hidden misgivings. The new commandant arrived and seemed much less brutal than the last one. So finally the colonists felt safe and secure enough to voice their displeasure at the cruelty on display. But this is precisely at the time where it has no impact either way. As the officer makes pains to emphasize, the new commandant would almost certainly decommission the torture device because it flies in the face of how he thinks a penal colony should be run. So the people of the town voice their concerns just when there is no risk in doing so, and no consequence of doing so. They are revealed not to be bold revolutionaries opposing a vile regime, but cowards, who are willing to stand up for what's right, provided that they incur no danger to themselves in the process. And I think there is an insight in here for us all. Just as the veneer of a moral reason is sometimes placed atop some underlying cruelty, we can also turn a blind eye to our values when self-interest is at stake. None of us are immune to this urge. No matter how high the horse we climb onto might be, there is always the snag of our innate psychology pulling us back down to earth. But an interesting part of the story is how Kafka has the officer explain the inner workings of the machine in gruesome detail. And in doing so, we gain another insight into how people can commit horrors while guarding their own conscience. 3. The aesthetics of evil. The officer's description of his machine is almost erotic in both detail and tone. He takes the traveller around to examine different parts of it, and shows off its brutality with glee. He marvels at the engineering work, and is more distressed if something goes wrong with the gears of the machine than at the prospect of torturing a man to death. He boasts of how, in the good old days, when it was maintained properly, it could work for 12 hours without a hitch. As I said before, the officer is partly enraptured by the machine because he sees it as a bringer of justice, but it's also because he revels at the near-perfect order of it all. He is so bewitched by the neatness and the precision of the execution device that he fails to ask the ultimate question: should he use it? The officer suffers from a tactical lack of imagination. When the traveller raises the question of whether it might be best if this machine is put to rest, the officer seems baffled. He sees the utility of the device as so self-evident that it doesn't make sense to question it. It would be like asking him whether 2 + 2 = 4, or whether the sun would rise tomorrow. It strikes at the base layer of his beliefs. Wittgenstein, in his book On Certainty, talks about a class of beliefs which are held so strongly that nothing can supplant them. He points out that in order for one belief to justify another, the justifying belief has to be held more strongly than the justified belief. And also that for one belief to challenge another, the challenging belief must be held more strongly than the challenged belief. So, if we were to follow this hierarchy down, we would eventually stumble across beliefs that are so strongly held that it wouldn't make any sense for us to challenge them, but nonetheless aren't properly justified either. Asking someone whether logic is a proper method of forming opinions might elicit this sort of baffled response. On the one hand, it is difficult to justify logic on any other grounds than logical ones. And on the other, we want to say something like, what do you mean is logic justified? I don't have any other way of regulating thought. In a different but related vein, French philosopher Michel Foucault used to talk about epistemes, sets of beliefs that are embedded in a culture or society such that no one would ever think to question them, even if, in truth, there might be dire issues with them. But the officer's marvel at the machine's deadly engineering demonstrates another terrifying human tendency, our endless fascination with horrifying entertainment. Part of the reason the officer never questions the legitimacy of the machine is because he is so enraptured with its beauty. He is clearly entertained when someone is suffering under its blade, and describes the scream of a victim much like one would describe a melody of a song. And the officer is displaying an extreme version of quite a commonplace human habit, to find something entertaining or joyful in the suffering of others. Whether it is gladiatorial combats, public hangings, or the sick pleasure of watching someone have a mental breakdown online, it seems there's a certain human inclination to revel in cruelty and barbarity, especially if it's happening to someone we deem as morally inferior. After all, then the moral question is answered. They deserve it, and we can move on to looking at aesthetic considerations. Once we've decided it is right for the victim to die, then we can comment on the artistry of the hangman. In some ways, this demonstrates the most admirable and the least pleasant parts of human nature. In an odd way, it's deeply affirming that our species can find something beautiful in something so brutal. But on the other hand, is this a quality that we really want to cultivate? Isn't it just a way to distract ourselves from the disaster that's actually happening? Like marvelling at the arrangement of the deck chairs on the Titanic, to borrow a common phrase. I don't have the answer to these questions, but I think that Kafka's short book raises all of this and more. But what about when the officer realises that his moral system is doomed and his device will surely be dismantled? What happens then? Well, that is just what we will move on to next. 4. The Mirror of Morality. One of my favourite quotes from the Bible is from the book of Matthew, and it reads as follows: "Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you." Separate from any theology, it contains a wonderful insight into how our moral systems function in practice. As individuals, we often look to how people judge others to see how they themselves should be judged. And Kafka demonstrates the harsh side of this in the eventual fate of the officer. Once the officer has accepted that his precious device will soon be disassembled, he seems to sense the moral winds changing direction. He seems to realise that just as he viewed people as criminals, as morally beneath him, now the same fate will befall him too. Thus, he makes the quite gruesome decision to sacrifice himself to his own vision of justice, to plug himself into the torture machine. Kafka's narrator points out that the officer is acting completely rationally. Since he is now on the bottom of the moral dung heap, it is he that should be fed into the torture device. The officer has never questioned his ethical system before, so why should he start now? The same moral instincts that led him to torture others have given birth to a sort of reflective conscience, and now he is duty-bound to condemn himself by the same logic. Having outsourced all of his moral thinking to a vague sense of justice and the old commandant, he has nothing to fall back on when the moral spotlight is pointed at him. And the fact he's being plugged into his own torture machine is important here. He is not simply facing moral condemnation, he's facing it in the exact same way he imposed it on others. The system of supposed justice is now eating its own tail. Now, I don't know if this was Kafka's intention, but he has highlighted the unpleasant fate that awaits the enforcers of morality as soon as the moral system changes, and the old one is seen as outdated and barbaric. Just as they were once the judges on high, dealing out impartial justice, brutal and swift, now they are sitting in the dock, awaiting the sentence passed to them by the new moral arbiters. The witchfinder generals are condemned by history as monsters, and the Roman practice of crucifixion is seen as inhumane and immoral. In each case, the instruments of one moral system are condemned by the lights of the next. It makes me wonder who will sit in judgment of us in years to come, and what crimes they will find us guilty of. And will they treat the enforcers of our common morality in the same way that we treat the enforcers of old? To bring this point down to earth, let's look at an issue that is on everybody's lips: online shaming. Anecdotally, something I've noticed is the people who face the harshest condemnations, the most spiteful insults, and the heaviest reactions are precisely those who have previously billed themselves as in line with moral thinking. Then, when the moral system changes, or they unintentionally fall afoul of a pre-existing rule, that is not just a transgression, it is an out-and-out betrayal. They have billed themselves as a moral arbiter and they have been found morally lacking. Thus, they are condemned by harsher words, and for smaller slights, than those who never claimed to be anything morally special. Now, obviously, I'm not arguing that no one should condemn someone else for perceived immorality. Arguably, our whole moral system would crawl to a halt if it had no enforcers. I am just using Kafka's text to highlight a dark side of this system that is often forgotten, that the privileges of being a moral enforcer come at the cost of a much stricter punishment if one is found to have moral stains. But lastly, I want to look at who would have been the victim of the torture machine, the condemned man, and what we can all learn from his particular relationship with the execution device. 5. Revenge, resentment, and moral standards. Throughout the whole work, the condemned man does not speak, but nonetheless, his actions can give us a deep insight into how people behave when they are powerless, and more importantly, how they behave when the tables are turned, and their tormentors become powerless themselves. The condemned man shares some similarities with the officer that at first seem really quite peculiar. He too seems obsessed with the grisly torture device. Even when he does not yet know that he will be its victim, he pays careful attention to the officer's demonstrations, seemingly sharing in admiration at its design and sophistication. Just like the domineering officer, the powerless prisoner also has a vested interest in knowing all about the instruments of power, both out of a morbid fascination of what might happen to him and following the old dictum of knowing one's enemy. Then, when he's placed in the machine, the condemned man shows not the sort of unimaginable fear that might be appropriate, but instead a sort of despairing resignation. He clearly knows what awaits him is a painful and horrifying fate, but he is so convinced of his lack of power that he doesn't even resist. But perhaps most interesting is what happens when the officer gives himself over to the machine. The prisoner immediately recognizes a chance for revenge, and, as Kafka puts it, a wide, silent laugh appeared on his face and did not go away. Now the previously condemned man is all too eager to be the one wielding the power. He hurriedly straps the officer down with the aid of a guard, and he takes great pleasure at seeing the torture device at work on the officer. As the officer is stabbed over and over again by the malfunctioning contraption, the prisoner seemingly delights at every moment. He is being avenged, and despite the traveller's plea for help, he turns his back. He will not aid his old tormentor. The transition of the condemned man from helpless victim to brimming with glee at the suffering of the officer is fascinating to me, because I think it is, at some level, deeply relatable. Most people have at some point been victimized or have been helpless in the face of someone else's will. And we do often engage in a bit of schadenfreude if the tables ever do turn. I don't say this as some sort of moral condemnation, but rather to draw out an often unnoticed aspect of our behaviour. We are, to a certain extent, vengeful creatures. And from the Code of Hammurabi to clamours for retributive justice today, this yearning for revenge is part of our psyche that we often like to ignore. But it's always lurking just beneath the surface, ready to strike if it's ever needed. This reminds me of a really underrated work of philosophy by Albert Camus, The Rebel. In The Rebel, Camus undertakes an analysis of revolutions who end up committing unimaginable acts of cruelty in the name of some greater good. He points out that just as people sometimes use righteousness to cloak their own cruelty, sometimes justice is just a fancy word for revenge. And I want to end on this note. If there's one thing I took away from In the Penal Colony, it's that humans have an almost limitless ability to justify their own brutality. We may claim that it is for the greater good, or that it is just, or that it is necessary, and we may even be correct. But just as often, these words are simply a mask, beneath which lies an expression twisted in anger and hungry for revenge. Sometimes we spend so long worrying about how we'll suffer at the hands of others that we fail to notice the cruel instinct within ourselves. And if you want to explore this theme of justifying our worst impulses further, then click here to learn about Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment and how philosophy can be used to kill. And stick around for more on thinking to improve your life.